So a carbon footprint is a representation of kind of what kind of impact we're having in many ways on the Earth, with a focus on carbon dioxide. And why do we care about carbon dioxide? Well, we care because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and it's what's heating our atmosphere faster than it would naturally because of particularly burning of fossil fuels. And so that climate change that comes from increased greenhouse gases is really having a wide swath of negative impacts on, well, just about every part of human lives, the natural world, and such. And so it's critically important for us to use tools like this to understand what our individual impacts are, our own carbon footprints are, what they are from our communities, from our states, from our countries. So from very local and individual all the way up to the global scale, because it's a global problem, climate change. And so calculating our carbon footprint gives us a real good sense of not just the obvious stuff that we do that produces carbon and produces greenhouse gases, but some of the hidden impacts that come from the food we eat, the clothes that we wear, the where we move, how we move around, where we live. And so the carbon footprint is a critically important tool to make those carbon impacts really clear. Well, climate change is a big umbrella term for a lot of things going on. First and foremost, it is tied to changes in our atmosphere, the concentrations of various gases, a number of which, like carbon dioxide or methane, trap heat in. So it keeps it in our atmosphere and produces a higher temperature in and around the Earth. And so climate change is including the focus on what we as humans are doing to make those changes happen faster because of things that we're doing, burning fossil fuels primarily. And so climate change means that literally we're getting warmer. Well, okay, it was a little warmer, you turn your air conditioner down or you open the window, right? Well, it's not like that. Very small changes have huge impacts on our ecosystems, on factors that impact our health, impact the food we grow and where we can grow and what we can grow. So it has tremendous impacts. We often are kind of made to think that the changes are small and insignificant because we often focus on a global average temperature change. Well, an average is an average, and it doesn't account for extremes that in some places, like the poles, that we're seeing dramatic changes in temperature, dramatic changes in those environments that have, even though they're far away, dramatic impacts for us. And so the melting of glaciers, the thinning of Arctic sea ice seems like a long way away and sometimes is almost trivialized, like will or won't the polar bear be able to swim to the next piece of ice, but in fact have fundamental impacts on weather systems, on temperatures, on well, really kind of all parts of life, human and otherwise. And so while climate change kind of captures a lot of things and can therefore seem diffuse and slow and not specific to any one of us, it really means that it is all-encompassing and critically important for us all to take account, even if we don't exactly understand precisely how it's going to impact us in one place and time. But it really is impacting us already, and it's going to do so even more in the future. The primary causes of climate change are multiple, but I would say first and foremost, it's the burning of fossil fuels, which puts carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Where we live, how we heat the buildings that we're in, how we use energy and transportation and industrial processes, these are all critically important. It's also important to remember that it's a really complex system, and so carbon dioxide can be sequestered in what are called sinks, but really think of a tree, think of a forest, think of the ocean as places where carbon dioxide is sequestered or kept. And so when we cut down forests, we're actually releasing CO2 as well, carbon dioxide as well. So it's not just the burning of the fossil fuels, but it is the destruction of, or the overburdening of these other ecological systems that keep carbon out of the atmosphere and not having that greenhouse gas effect. So there is definitely natural variation in the temperature and the concentrations of the mix of gases that we have in our atmosphere. But in a variety of ways, scientists are able to determine that what's happening is faster and the changing concentrations that are directly tied to what are called anthropogenic or human-caused reasons that allow for them to understand how much faster it is due to human versus natural variability, human action versus natural variability. And so that is, for example, really important when one looks at, for example, one of the prominent manifestations of changing climates, which is changing air and sea water temperatures and what that means for, say, hurricanes. Well, it's not that the hurricane would or wouldn't have happened because of climate change, but what might have been a much smaller storm becomes a much more intense and damaging storm under the scenarios of climate change and our increase of fossil fuel usage and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the climate change impacts. And so in that sense, it is, there's a lot of science behind it. So there is the real technical discussion that one can have, but it is one that with confidence, with multiple methods in multiple ways and places, scientists are able to establish with actually quite a bit of granularity what impacts are due to humans and how it would be different under scenarios of natural variability. Deforestation is absolutely critical to climate change and how it progresses. It's critical because trees sequester or they serve as what we call carbon sink. They hold carbon in, so it's not in the atmosphere, not playing this greenhouse gas warming role when carbon is in the atmosphere. And so more forests means more carbon sequestration, and when we cut them down, particularly ones that like in the tropical forests where we have some of the world's largest forests left today, that really is lost for a very long time because they're so slow growing and really complex ecosystems, and the soil is very poor, it's really hard and takes a very long time to regrow those kinds of forests. Agriculture of all types, and particularly large-scale agriculture that requires clearing of large swaths of land, has, on the one hand, a logic of efficiency and size and such, but it also particularly is very energy intensive, and particularly when it's fertilizer or pesticide intensive, which have negative impacts on the ecosystem from those chemicals, but also take a lot of energy to produce them and deploy them over and over and over again. And so that has a big carbon footprint, and it also really depends on what's being grown. So we know, for example, that if agriculture in terms of livestock and animal-based protein, a huge carbon footprint created by eating particularly beef, heavy water intensity and heavy energy intensity, in part because you have to grow a lot to feed the cows, a lot to feed the pigs. And so they're carbon intensive, and then they also produce a notable amount of methane, which also serves as a greenhouse gas, and so accelerates the problem there as well. In some parts of the world, it's that kind of large-scale agriculture is leading to deforestation of some of the world's last great forests. And so in that sense, too, even just preparing the land to convert to agriculture, and particularly these big monoculture approaches, means that we're losing the ability to sequester carbon, to keep carbon in trees and ecosystems, too. So there are lots of ways that you can move to kind of all throughout. Where is the food for local consumption, or is it for moving it around the world? And then you have an additional carbon footprint from the transportation of those crops. So and then unfortunately we waste a lot of it. There's huge food wastage, and so that's in some ways wasted energy as well as wasted food, and often have a big carbon footprint associated with food that isn't even consumed. fossil fuels are central to driving the climate change challenge, problem, crisis that we have today. Fundamentally, it's a kind of basic science issue of burning fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere and serves as a greenhouse gas and warms the Earth's atmosphere, the Earth's oceans, our cities, our habitat, literally and figuratively, and they have been critically important and are in many ways critically important, but they are not necessary to live the life that we need to live. And in many places in the world, there is energy poverty. There needs to be more energy consumed. But there's been a very kind of facile assumption that this is how we've done it and it's the only way we can do it. And we're increasingly seeing that in many instances, there are viable alternatives that are not always the same in the same places. They're not always easily accessible, especially early on. But it really requires us to fundamentally rethink how we move, how we live, how we power our cities, how we power our factories, how we heat our homes and keep ourselves safe. Fossil fuels are essential to solving that challenge. And it's not an easy conversation, it's not a fast conversation, but it is one that provides opportunity as well as threat. And I think part of the key to understanding that is to sit down and work together and understand that it's going to mean things for changing jobs for people and who've been in that sector for generations. And that's not a trivial issue for them. At the same time, there are real opportunities that come from moving away from fossil fuels to other non-carbon based sources of energy. I think change, period, is difficult for humans. We, for a lot of very understandable reasons, like what is familiar, what is safe, what is known. And we have had an economy largely driven by fossil fuels for a very long time. And so the uncertainty that comes with change, and the changing of winners and losers, and that come with new technologies and new markets, just like they do in all sorts of other, what's the latest fashion or what, the change begets some resistance. But in many ways, what we need to do is really find a way to reimagine the good life that isn't about bigger is better and more is better. And that it is not about a consumption-driven definition of success. It's about being rich in experiences and being rich in ways that don't require just consuming more and more and more. And that's about what car you drive, what size of the house you live in, where you go on vacation, how you get there, when you do it, whether, so in that sense, it really is about reimagining the world that we live in. And so that's scary stuff, that's big stuff. And so it's not surprising that we can't just literally flip a switch and have a different way of organizing ourselves, because it is kind of built into so many things that I won't say dependence, because we've clearly been able to move away from it and can do it, but that familiarity with those systems and the real kind of advantages that keeping that system have, like we have gasoline stations, far more gas stations than we do recharging stations for electric vehicles, for example. That infrastructure really matters when you're talking about various parts of the economy. And so we have to build that out and we have to move towards it, even if it is something that is less familiar and unknown and less comfortable, but it needs to be made exciting and seen as an opportunity and critical to our being able to survive and thrive in a warmer world. certainly the awareness of the real challenges for warming temperatures in the dynamic of climate change have been something that, on the one hand, we've known about the greenhouse effect for a very long time in terms of certain gases trap more heat in the atmosphere. But it's really only in the last 40 plus years, that scientists have kind of come and said, this is really a problem for the rate of change and that this is going to mean for temperature, and that it's going to have wide-ranging impacts, and that we need to start moving away from fossil fuels to other non-carbon-based sources of energy. And so in some ways, that's a very short kind of period for adjustment, given it took us a couple hundred years from industrialization to come to where we are today. However, the dictates of how fast the climate is changing and temperatures are changing and the impacts that those have, we don't have a lot of time. So we don't have 200 years to figure it out. We have to move much quicker. So while the basic scientific principles have been known for a long time, 40 years is a long time on the one hand, but in terms of the big kind of massive changes, it's not, but we don't have the luxury of time to have it take so long going forward. We have to move much quicker. The everyday person contributes to climate change in a lot of ways, by the food that they choose to eat. Do they have a heavy animal-based protein diet? Well, that's going to be a more carbon-intense diet. Do they take public transportation or bike or walk to work, or do they drive and commute a long way and burn a lot of fossil fuels on the way to work? How warm in the winter and cold in the summer do they keep their house? So the building that they live in is going to have a big impact. How energy efficient is their source of energy? If they have solar panels, and that's not going to be a big footprint. If they have a well-insulated house, that's going to be less of a footprint. If they're willing to put on a sweater in the winter to stay warm, and so they don't have to turn up the heat quite so much, that's going to make an impact. Where and how they decide to go on vacation. Flying in a plane is a very carbon-intense way to move around, perhaps the most. And so making choices about how much one flies for work and for pleasure. And again, that's for those people in the world who have that as an option. There are many people who don't at all. And so it would be answered in a different way depending on where you sat in the world and where you sat in terms of your level of wealth or poverty. And I think it is critical to remember that those who are wealthier produce often a lot more carbon or consume a lot more carbon. There are obviously a lot of people in the world, and oftentimes the finger can be pointed at the rapid growth of populations, and certainly the number of people matter. But really what is, I think, critical is to understand per capita, the individuals, and it's not the same. You'll have a much bigger carbon footprint if you are consuming at this higher level that often is associated with greater wealth than poverty. Well, we're starting to be able to understand what climate impacts are down at a more focused area, a focused geography, say, and so what that means in the Midwest or in Ohio or in Appalachia. It is still one where bringing the precise understandings down to be able to make forecasts like we do with weather. It's not in that realm. But we can talk about how changing temperatures, how they affect various species in terms of when the blooming happens in plants, or where the range that particularly say mosquitoes and mosquito-borne diseases can be appearing in places earlier or where they haven't appeared before. And so those are the ways that we look at changes at a kind of more local level. I think we will see and are seeing some of these changes in terms of what it means for seasonal temperature and some of the species, and in some ways a kind of a migration north of ones that were traditionally associated with here and are going north in a sense, where the temperatures aren't so warm. I think we are starting to see and going to see more of changing nature of rainfall, and so it may even not be that different in the amounts. But the intensity of storms may mean that, for example, we get a lot more rain in a few storms rather than the spread out over a variety. And of course, if you're a farmer, that really matters in terms of if you're dependent on rain-fed agriculture. And so the flooding events, we're trying to understand, for example, what is it going to mean for, say, a particularly vulnerable segment of our population, older adults who need to regularly get out and get access to healthcare. Well, are they going to increasingly be impeded in getting that kind of access that they need because of increased flooding events? We have a lot of people who live near creeks and streams that flood. And so that's something that is kind of a tangible manifestation of what I think we need to prepare for here in Appalachia, to understand that that is going to that's going to be more common in the future as we understand it under climate change. And those are the kinds of adaptations that we're going to have to make. Well, I think we can start to protect the environment as individuals and as a society, to understand that it is not a single sector, a single silo of issues that are meant for the environmentalists or the ecologists to take care of, and the rest of us can go on with our lives. It's something that it impacts us all. We all have impacts on the environment, and so all of us are responsible for thinking about ways that we can move to a less consumptive lifestyle and a less energy, particularly fossil fuel-based energy intensive lifestyle. So that's in a practical way, we can think about how we get to work or how we move around in transportation. There's some really practical steps that we can think about that every time we change the thermostat in the house. We can think about how we make some longer term investments so that we invest in solar panels or buy into local providers that are investing in producing that energy or delivering that energy that has a solar basis rather than a fossil fuel base. We can decide to have a less animal protein rich diet. We can increase, even just a couple days a week, the number of meals that we have that are vegetarian, right? Those have very meaningful impacts. And then in a larger scale, but still things that individuals can do, we can advocate for leaders and policies and laws that take this into account and scale it up and make it a priority that is a political and an economic and a social priority, and not just kind of put it on the back of well-intentioned and aware individuals, but understand that this is something that has to go to scale, that has to be engaged with by the public sector, the private for-profit sector, the private not-for-profit sector, faith communities. This is the military. This is an all-hands-on-deck kind of scenario. And so we need to expect that of ourselves, and we need to expect that of our leaders all across the board in the different aspects of our lives. I think it's essential to our well-being as a human species and the species that we care about in the larger natural world. I think it is it's like asking, how should we take care of the home that we live in? Should we take care of our loved ones? Should we take care of our own personal health and well-being? Because they're inextricably connected. And so while it may be easy to insulate at times ourselves from the impact of the health of the environment, really at the end of the day we won't be, because we are fundamentally dependent on it, and it provides opportunity, and it provides threat. And so understanding that it is not us standing above the natural environment, but as a dependent part of it, is critical to our making progress. That comes with some humility and some awareness and some willingness to inform ourselves and think differently and act differently and live differently.